You know what you're listening to?
Is that a trick question?
It's the I Still Love This Game podcast with your host, Matthew Damian.
He's an idiot. Don't listen to this. He's an idiot.
Hello and welcome to the I Still Love This Game show, the I Still Love This Game podcast. Whatever you want to call it, you are more than welcome to do that. A lot to cover. In today's episode, tonight's episode, I should say. Obviously, episodes 3 and 4 of The Last Dance have just aired and just finished airing 3 minutes ago, actually. I'm looking at the clock right now. And obviously, I'll be going over those episodes. In addition to that, I'll be also addressing some emails that I've gotten, as well as the criticisms of what we saw in episodes 1 and 2. And the desperation of certain fan bases who are now presented with the context. So for far too long, ignorance has been able to fester in the modern NBA fan. And that brings me to one of the emails that I wanted to get out of the way really early. Well, there's two actually. I got a couple of these emails asking me, and when I say emails, I'm also including direct messages. Sorry. But one of them pointed out that how enthusiastic I was for the last episode. And that's been a play on words. And people have often asked me why the name of the show is I Still Love This Game when I'm so critical of the current NBA. And I love basketball. Basketball is something that I'm very passionate about. The NBA is not. And despite that, the show that I have mainly talks about the NBA. Sometimes we'll talk about college basketball, but anything that ties to the NBA, I will be talking about. And I wanted to clarify something here is I love this older stuff. I'm not an old head. You'll probably be surprised if you ever found out my age. But I really love watching this historical stuff, and it's got nothing to do with the Bulls. It's just the older, like the 30 for 30s. My favorite series still to this date, it isn't The Last Dance, although it's getting up there. But it was actually the Lakers and Celtics 30 for 30. I absolutely love that. So I love that whole context, those old documentaries, the old content, and the context that's associated with it. So that's why you're probably hearing me so passionate right now and happy, because I really like talking about this stuff. I don't like talking about Twitter beefs or Twitter feuds or who's following each other on Instagram or any of that nonsense. That to me is ridiculous. Now we've gotten that out of the way. I also wanted to talk about some thoughts that I had on episodes 1 and 2 now that I've had a week to digest them. And the greatness of Scottie Pippen. And this pains me to bring this up because I respect Scottie Pippen a lot. I think he's a top 25 player of all time, one of the best defensive players of all time. But I think he was a little bit overrated in some of the footage that we saw. And I don't mean to be nasty when I say this. I really don't. But Scottie Pippen, in his peak, 94 and 95, without question, individually at least, right? Let's put this into context a little bit. In 94, when he was an MVP candidate, and rightly so, Phil Jackson, the mastermind of the Bulls, when the Bulls were down 2-0 to the Knicks, Game 3 is in Chicago. They are down by 1 point. They had a big lead. They need this game to get back in the series. There's night and day in terms of difference between being down 3-0 and down 2-1 heading into Game 4. And they are down by 1 point with 1 second left. They had a big lead in that entire game. All the momentum is with New York. Phil Jackson does not go to Scottie Pippen. He goes to Tony Kukoc. And it worked out. It worked out totally for the Bulls because Kukoc made the turnaround game winner. But it just goes to show what Pippen's value was in those critical moments and what kind of a leader he really was. And fast forward about 8 months, I guess you could say, just around the All-Star weekend, which was in Phoenix. of all places. And Scottie Pippen, who people are saying was like a lot of, it's not the majority, all right? It's a silent minority. Not the silent, it's a loud minority, excuse me. They're now saying that Pippen was the guy that carried Jordan to those titles, and I'll get to that in a minute, trust me, I will. But keep in mind that the Bulls were very close to trading Scottie Pippen for Dan Marley. You know, the same guy that a lot of people are actually saying that Jordan was able to exploit because he wasn't a very talented guy. He was an unathletic white guy. So, and it was actually Phoenix that nixed that deal. It wasn't Chicago. Chicago was very willing to make that trade. So just a couple of things to point that out. Dennis Rodman. We started this episode 3 was on Rodman. And one of the very first things that he said is quite controversial. Although it shouldn't be controversial, but it's taken way out of context. And he posed the question, would they have won without him? Could they have won them from 96 to 98 without him? 96, probably not. 97, yes. 98, yes. And the reason I say that is in 96 you had Rodman, who was focused and consistent throughout the entire season, the entire playoffs, and he was the Bulls were able to use him and rely on him. In the 97 and 98 playoffs, you did not get that. And I'm glad that the documentary actually showed that Rodman could be very hit or miss. He could be very up or down in terms of what his focus levels, and that was critical in terms of getting production from him. So let's go back to 96. Could they have won without him? No. Does that mean he was the most integral part or the most valuable player? Also, no. Because there are lots of role players in the history of the NBA, in every single team. Do the Lakers with Shaq and Kobe, do they win without Derek Fisher? No, they don't. Let's be honest. Maybe in 2000, when Fisher was just coming off the bench, but in 2001 and 2002, no, they don't. Let's use Miami Heat. Does LeBron and Wade and Bosh, do they win without Mario Chalmers? Also, no. The Houston Rockets, do they win without Robert Horry? Maybe in 94, definitely not in 95. We could go through the list of nearly every team and you can find role players. You can say, okay, without their production, they don't win. And Dennis Rodman, as great as what he was as a rebounder and a defensive player, although that's a misconception too that they sort of had in this, because he wasn't the stellar defensive player that he was in Detroit. In Chicago, he could still D up, especially on the perimeter. On the post. He wasn't a perimeter defender anymore. But they weren't getting that Rodman that was, in a league of his own almost in Detroit as a defensive player. So they were getting a guy that his specialty was rebounding, fantastic role player, but he was just that. He was very good at what he did, but he was just that. The same way that Steve Kerr is very good at shooting the basketball. It's just what it is. It's just what it is. Without Jordan and Pippen and Jackson, they were really the three guys that took them to the next level. It wasn't Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman gave them a bit of an edge, especially in 96, but in 97 and 98, he was almost more of a negative because of his inconsistencies. Now, there was that period that they were talking about where he helped right the ship with Jordan, with some leadership, with Pippen being out in the early parts of the 97-98 season. But beyond that, he was very, very inconsistent. He was missing games. He was checked out mentally. He was going through the motion. So I think Dennis Rodman, and that's a good segue because I think Dennis Rodman was thoroughly bored with basketball. I don't think the challenge was ever there from a fundamental standpoint when it came to basketball. He didn't grow up playing it. He grew up in Oklahoma. He didn't start playing. He was a freak athlete, very good athlete. But you can just tell that there was times that, like, he wanted to win, but I think he wanted he wanted respect more than he wanted winning. I think he wanted people to be like, that's one tough guy. That's one guy that will, and that's why you see some of the theatrics, when a ball's clearly about to go out of bounds, there's nothing you can do to save it. He'll still dive head first for it. He would take charges on Carmelo, and he'd take elbows from Carmelo and Shaq. He would do those things, and they would help his team, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, I think he was also doing that so he could bring attention to himself as well, which is nothing wrong with that because it still benefited the team. But I think at times he was just thoroughly bored with basketball. And he may have been such a basketball intellect, which might sound funny to people that don't really understand the game. But when you hear him having conversations with Jordan, he's on the same level of intellect as Jordan. He can understand and diagnose those plays on the fly as well. So I think he was bored with basketball, but also, and I alluded to this as well when I said, the Bulls got a different guy than what we saw in Detroit, and really, the San Antonio, the transition from Rodman from Detroit to San Antonio, really set him down on a spiraling path. Because I think he was, and I can't put this all on Chuck Daly here. Chuck Daly helped, control him to a certain extent. But I think when he went to San Antonio and he had Bob Hill and David Robertson, they're not exactly the strongest willed guys. And Rodman tested them and they capitulated. And he lost all interest. So Jordan and Jackson really were they were smart enough to realize what they needed to do. Because Rodman is high maintenance. Make no mistake about it. For all the things that he will do for you, he doesn't need to take a lot of shots. I get that. So you might think, there was a statistic that came up, he had 7 games with 20 rebounds, but 0 points. You might think, well, that's great. He's low maintenance. He's really high maintenance because you need to walk a fine line of showing him that you care about winning, but you've also got to give him enough space to do what he wants and be a distraction. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, as they almost contradict one another. And then, I do have a couple of criticisms of this documentary. Is the way that it chops and changes. You start in 98, then it goes back to 89, then it goes to 93, then it goes to 91, then it goes to 89 again. It's all over the place. It really is. And the other criticism I have is that the lack of focus, ironically, because we just talked about focus with Rodman, the lack of focus on the 98 season. We just watched 2 hours, and we probably got about 20 minutes of content about the 98 season. But it's okay, it's setting the context up, and we're leading into Doug Collins now. Now, there was something that they showed like a mix of Jordan highlights. And I've seen a lot of these retrospectively. So, it's not like I grew up watching this stuff, 89 or whatever. And my jaw was still dropped at this, but I've already seen these plays, and it says something that when I'm watching this and I'm shaking my head at these plays, I already know what's going to happen because I've seen it before and I still shake my head at it. That's incredible when you think about that, because the impact that team and those plays and that player, Jordan, had, because you can't say he doesn't stand the test of time then. He really does. It's not like I'm looking back and thinking, it was good for that time, or it was good for that period. Could he do it now? Could he do it in the 60s? No, I'm looking at that, I'm thinking, we haven't seen any. His body control is unbelievable in some of those plays. He's just gliding right past. It's insane. Couple of things, moving on from that, is I can't remember who said it, but they said that the Cavs and the Bulls were the teams most likely to challenge the Pistons after the Pistons knocked off the Celtics. That wasn't the case. After Doug Collins came in, and they experimented with a lot of things, including playing Jordan at point guard and things of that nature, it was the Knicks and the Cavs that were actually considered the teams most likely to really challenge the Pistons for supremacy. And it wasn't Chicago at all. In fact, they talked about the Cavs and the Bulls series. That was actually the first round series. And the Cavs were the second seed, which meant, guess what? The Bulls were the seventh seed. So that gives you an idea of exactly how big of an upset that shot was, how shocking that shot was. And you know what shot I'm referring to. And after the Bulls obviously won game 1 and they won game 3, people just assumed when Jordan choked at the foul line that after game 4 that, you know, it was going to be okay. The Cavs were going to win. They were going to move on. I think, and I don't say this as a prisoner of the moment, which is funny to say when you think about it because it was over 30 years old. I think that might have been the greatest shot of all time, the greatest clutch shot of all time. Not the most impactful, because I think that's the 98 shot that he hit. But in terms of just his body control, getting open against, they talked about Craig Elo being on him, but he was actually had Larry Nance as well. He's being doubled off the ball. The fact that he even got open to get that speaks volumes. And then to the body control once again, because he has to go full speed to cut, to get away from both of them, and then to cut back. And he was almost open for a second, and he elevated straight up. He wasn't fading on that shot. So he elevated straight up. And they didn't show the right angle, but there's an angle that you can see Craig Elo gets his hand on the ball. But because Elo's ends up going right past him, Jordan goes straight up. And Elo is going so fast, he can't go straight up with him. And that's why you see Jordan reposition his hands. It shows how strong Jordan's hands are too. He was able to make that shot. What a shot. On the road as well. And then after that series, people don't talk about this. They had to go and they thoroughly dominated New York. And this is once again as a 7th seed without home court advantage. Jordan was spectacular in that series. Maybe more impressive than what he was against the Cavs, which is saying quite a lot. The Pistons did slow him down, but and the reason why I say that is obviously they beat them, and they were talking about, when I say the slowing him down, that they obviously got it because everyone was almost, because keep in mind the Bulls were up 2-1. People were probably starting to think that, hey, this Bulls team is going to go to the finals and go on to play the Lakers. Kareem's last year, Magic is still playing, obviously, Worthy is still playing. So the Pistons got in the way and they slowed that down. They slowed the progress of Jordan getting to the ascension of Jordan and the Bulls getting to the finals. But they almost made him unbeatable by doing so. Because by being tested as tough as they tested him mentally, psychologically, they did make the Bulls better. They did make Scottie Pippen better. They forced them to bring in Phil Jackson. Otherwise, they would have had Doug Collins as a coach. But when you think about that, the fact that Jordan and the Bulls got better psychologically because of this, they got tougher psychologically. It was almost like, okay, the Pistons slowed them down a little bit, but there's a good chance that Jordan doesn't go 6-0 in that case. Maybe he ends up with more rings, but there's a good chance that he would have lost to the Lakers in one of those series. We also heard a couple of things, and it shows the contradictory nature of what, we constantly hear Isaiah Thomas now calling LeBron better than Jordan. But he was actually in 1989 calling Jordan the greatest player. This is before he had even won. You heard John Sally call him not human. But the big thing, and I'm not sure if this is going to be really picked up on, but the Pistons have always denied trying to hurt Jordan. They've always said, look, we'll just, if we had to give a hard foul, we'd give a hard foul. That's just part of the game, right? They finally admitted that it was their intent to actually hurt him. They were trying to get him out of the game. They were trying to injure him. That's disgusting. That's truly disgusting. And quite honestly, it's consistent with their actions at the end of Game 4 when they lost, when they walked off the court. Also a lack of sportsmanship, also a lack of class, also a lack of dignity, also a lack of respect, not just to the Bulls, but to everybody before them and after them. To quote the great Vince McMahon, there is a time-honored tradition when you are passing the torch. And it's not just for the next guy that you're handing the belt to, the championship belt. It's for who's paved the way for you. And the fact that they didn't do that was disgraceful. And the fact that they tried to take out, because what if they were successful? What if they broke his leg? What if they dislocated his hip? What if they did something like that? What if they were successful with it? They would have ruined the game. They would have robbed the fans of Jordan's legacy. For what? For themselves? That's not the way. If you care about the game, you accept the result. And Jordan was touching on that. You know what? I totally get what he's saying when he's saying that, why there is some resentment from the Bulls still at this point. Because you can't just then retrospectively try to run it back like they were doing, like Isaiah was trying to run it back by saying that, the walk-off, now we understand because of the reaction. No. If the reaction got up and cheered him, they would own it. But now their attitude is more along the lines of, well, we got caught doing something that was wrong, so we're going to apologize for it. It's the whole thing, like when somebody apologizes for any offense that they've caused. Not the fact they've done it, but they're apologizing because the offense was taken. Anyway, getting back to Rodman. When Rodman was traded to San Antonio, Jackson, it's very underrated how much Jackson understood how to motivate him. And I talked about this before, about the Rodman being a high maintenance individual. And it showed the intelligence of Phil Jackson and to balance, we hear about the work-life balance now, right, when it comes to our careers. But Jackson's understanding of that from a professional athlete standpoint at that time was so far ahead of the game. It was ridiculous how he was able to get through to him and how he was able to see what Rodman needed to tick and what Jordan needed to tick and what we saw in the first episode with Pippen when Pippen was holding out to get the surgery. Phil Jackson wasn't angry at all. Jordan was, but Phil Jackson wasn't. Phil Jackson was saying no, he had to do this for himself to realize it, from his own mental standpoint, to get back on equal footing with the Bulls management. So it was really fascinating to see the differences between someone like Phil Jackson and, say, Bob Hill, who was the coach of San Antonio. And once again, it also shows how good Chuck Daly was as well, in a very different approach, of course. The contrast between Jordan and Rodman in terms of professionalism, that's one hell of a story with Carmen Electra. Carmen Electra having to hide in a Vegas hotel room while Jordan is there. My goodness. My goodness. I think even with Scottie Pippen and the trade of Dennis Rodman, I think Phil Jackson might have been Jerry Krause's greatest find. When you look at what I was saying before as well about his understanding of players. Like, he wasn't a great X's and O's coach, but he had Tex Winter for that. And I would say Phil Jackson is his greatest find. The Jackson replacing Doug Collins thing, they didn't go into depth into that. They didn't even touch on that. Jerry Krause did not want to make that move at that time. He knew what he had with Phil Jackson, but I think he also realized he couldn't control him the way that he could control Doug Collins. What actually happened was the Knicks offered Phil Jackson their head coaching position that off-season. So now it wasn't get rid of Doug Collins, put in Phil Jackson. It was we've got to promote Phil Jackson to the head coach of the Bulls. Otherwise, he's going to go to New York and he's going to be coaching Ewing. He's going to be coaching against he's going to be our biggest rival, and he's going to know Jordan like the back of his hand because he's spent so much time. So it was a reluctant move. It wasn't something that Krause wanted to do. They also didn't talk too much about Red Holzman and the influence that he played with Phil Jackson and his philosophies. Now, Red Holzman, a lot of people don't know who this guy is. He was the coach of the Knicks for their 1970 and 73 championships, I think it was, in New York. And one of his greatest feats, or one of his greatest visions that he had, his philosophies that he had, I'll get it out, is he passed on to Phil this is a player's game. Don't over-strategize, don't micromanage. And what he actually was able to pass on to Phil Jackson was let these players make the decisions on the fly. And then when you saw the triangle being introduced, you saw that. I can't remember what they said. I think it was something like, once that initial pass goes into the post, there's 31 options. Now, you can't remember, there's no way in preemptively trying to decide which play is going to be best because you don't know what the defense is going to show. The defense may play at something totally different, but that's up to the players then to react and to exploit it. That's one of the beautiful things about the triangle. The criticisms that Jordan actually had for not being able to lead a team to a championship. This is a real thing. People think that Jordan just came in and everybody loved him. And you hear, people say, like Colin Cowherd saying that the Bulls were the most loved team of all time. Maybe once they got over the hump, they were. But prior to that, they were not. They were treated with major disrespect, especially Jordan, because they thought he was just a stat padding individual player that didn't really care about winning. Nothing further can be said from the truth, but they really thought that that's what he was because he was putting up such great numbers to keep his team competitive. Like, think back to the series against the Celtics as the 8th seed, and he dropped 49 in the first game and then 63 in the next. That was to keep his team competitive. And people then thought, well, that's his only style. He only knows how to play to get numbers. But that wasn't the case. But it was very interesting to see that they actually finally touched on that, because we really don't see that too often. When people talk about Jordan, they talk about him being beloved. But there was a lot of criticism there from a lot of different players. If Chicago didn't win in 91, I think we could have seen some major dismantling of that team. You might have seen Scottie Pippen being traded. You might have seen Horace Grant being traded. You might have seen, we might have seen Charles Oakley coming back. They needed some tough players. And if Pippen and Grant couldn't produce that kind of mental toughness, then they probably would have gone. They probably would have been traded. Who knows where they would have been traded to? I haven't thought that far ahead. But that was, when you think about everything, the Pistons, I'm not going to say they're an old team because they weren't an old team. That's a dumb argument. Isaiah was 30 or 31. Joe Dumas, Dennis Rodman, all those guys were all the same age as Jordan. But they were playing a lot of basketball. And they had just been to 3 straight NBA finals. They had won 2 of them. And they did not have home court advantage for this series. The Bulls had dominated them in the regular season. They finished with a far superior record. Jordan was the MVP of the league again. And had they not won that series, we really could have seen a dismantling of the Chicago Bulls, or at least a significant restructure of the Chicago Bulls. What really got them over the hump, though, was Jordan's leadership. We can talk about the maturation of Horace Grant. We can talk about the maturation of Scottie Pippen. We can talk about the impact of Phil Jackson. But it was Jordan. They were all following Jordan's lead. Every single one of them. Even the veterans, Bill Cartwright, John Paxson, they were all following Jordan's lead. Jordan was the one that looked them dead in the eye, them being the Pistons, and didn't back down an inch. And that gave them all confidence to do the same thing. If Jordan wasn't there, do you think Pippen and Grant and those guys would have done it? Of course not. If Jordan's wavered with some of this stuff, do you think we would have seen Pippen and Grant stand up to them mentally? Of course not. This was all on Jordan. Let's not, and I'm not saying this to disrespect those guys. Phil Jackson played a massive role in this as well, because Jordan realized the importance of his teammates. Maybe that wouldn't have happened without Jackson. There's a good chance it wouldn't have, at least not so soon. But the fact remains that Jordan was the absolute catalyst for this. It wasn't anybody else. Now let's get back to the sweep itself. And I think that gets glossed over is exactly how significant it was that it was a sweep. Think about this. I just mentioned it a second ago. They had been to they being Detroit, they had been to 3 straight NBA finals. They had beaten Chicago 3 straight years. And they were the face of the league. They were the standard of the league. And they got swept on their own home court. 2-time defending champion. And that wasn't that they just lost. They were beaten so badly that they walked off prematurely. Now, Isaiah Thomas talked about Larry Bird leaving and all that. But you know what? Larry Bird has never had an issue shaking the hands of Magic Johnson or any of those other guys that he's lost to. The Knicks. At some point, if all this negative attention is based around one team, i.e. the Detroit Pistons, maybe they're the effing problem. Okay? Because they are the ones that it's always coming back to. Don't give me this sob story that, we'll just follow it. No. How are you following standard procedure? When Jordan, who wasn't even a champion at that point, at least an NBA champion, he was definitely an Olympic champion and a collegiate champion. If he had enough class and integrity and respect to shake their hands, the least you could do is do it back. And that's disappointing, that he's still coming up with excuses as to why he didn't do it. And instead of saying, we made a terrible mistake, he still doesn't say that. He still doesn't say that. And I can see why Jordan's got no time for him. We can see right through him. Horace Grant said it best. Called them straight up bitches. And that's hard to argue. Someone needs to make a t-shirt of that, by the way. Will Perdue, he had something else that was very interesting to me, saying that, they were obviously, after they won their first championship against Magic, and it was very important that it was against Magic as well. But he was referencing just after the Bulls had won, and Jordan was holding the championship trophy and crying, right? And Perdue was saying, we've seen it. We did, like, him being his own teammate saying this, so I can understand why it was easy for fans to also realize it too. But he was saying that when he saw Jordan crying, it reminded him that he was human. Well, duh, of course he was human. That's what makes it even more special what he was able to accomplish. Jordan was not some programmed robot out there. Of course he was susceptible to errors and mistakes and missing shots and turnovers and, being beaten defensively. Of course he was. He was human. If the standard of Jordan is perfection, it's crazy to me. No one else in any sport has had that standard thrown at them. And the final thought that I had from these past 2 episodes was after they had won their first title, Jordan wanting to be in the category of Bird and Magic. And he said that this title put him in that category of Bird and Magic. Now, what makes it even more important is we are watching the 98 season documentary. So it's meant to be a focus on that. This actually put him 1 title ahead of Magic, which makes you wonder if that was his goal, was to just be ahead of Magic in terms of championships. And had he not retired, obviously his sights would have been set. We're talking about potentially 8, 9, 10 in a row, potentially. They could have run it all the way from 91 all the way up to 2000. I don't have a whole lot of hesitation in saying they would have done that. He could have gone after Bill Russell's record. I really believe that. There's that. That's pretty much my initial thoughts on those two episodes that we just saw. So as I said, there's been a lot to talk about for those couple of episodes. But as promised, there was a lot of a reaction, and it was seemingly from one fan base who seemed awfully insecure about what just happened, what they had seen in episodes 1 and 2. So let's begin with some of these. I'm not going to name people because I'm not going to call them out like that. Doxing is a real thing. But let's start with it. How did Pippen win 55 games and never have a losing season without Jordan, but Jordan never won over 40 games or had a winning season without Pippen? I'm getting really sick of this question. I really am. Jordan... Okay, when Jordan retired, he retired when the Bulls were champions. Okay? When he got there, they were a laughingstock, and he made them a competitive team, even at a lower tier. And TJ, a friend of the podcast, he sent me a link with Kenny Smith on I think it's Danny Green's podcast, and he had the idea if the NBA comes back this year to just do single elimination. Now, can you imagine if you had a single elimination tournament for the championship when Jordan was playing in 84 or 85 or 86 without Pippen? They would be as much of a favorite as not obviously the Celtics or the Lakers, but the next tier, the 76ers, the Pistons, the Knicks, the Bucks, those teams, they would be right there because of Jordan. So Jordan made that team competitive. He changed that culture. So the Bulls now had a winning culture. You already had Pippen, you had Phil Jackson. They brought in Tony Kukoc. They brought in Steve Kerr. They brought in Luke Longley. B.J. Armstrong was still there. Horace Grant was still there. It wasn't just Pippen. And at the same time, look, the funny thing to me is the value of regular season victories. If we're just looking at regular season victories, tell me which is the best Golden State team of all time. Is it the one that won 73 wins and no championship, or the one with Kevin Durant? Because they only won 67. So if we're just going by regular season victory counts or victory totals, Kevin Durant made them worse. Technically, he made them worse. So which one is it? It's got to be one or the other. The next one is a quote. I believe it's from Kendrick Perkins. It is. If Bron, which is like the funniest nickname in the world. Very creative guys, by the way. If Bron scores 63 and 49 in a series and gets swept, every sports network is talking about his inability to get it done, while MJ is getting praised and awarded player of the game if he loses. Well, when has LeBron ever scored 60 points in a playoff? Let's see some, instead of these straw man arguments where we're able, do we have some actual tangible, and let's not forget, Jordan was getting criticized too. Well, he still couldn't get it done. He still couldn't lead his team to a title. And this is when he actually took them to the conference final. The difference is when LeBron has lost, he's typically been the reason as to why they've lost. In the 2007 finals, he played way under his actual numbers that he was putting up in the regular season and the playoffs up until that point. And that was a competitive series. Not one game was decided by more than 10 points. If LeBron played up to his own individual standard, there's a good chance that they at least win 2 games in that series, and they've got a chance to win. If he plays above his standard, there's a good chance they knock off the Spurs. And don't get me started on the 2011 final. We all know what happened then up against Dallas. We have seen plenty of times LeBron underperform. But I'll give you an example as to why this is so wrong. Think back to when in 07 and 08. So I just mentioned it before. when LeBron took his team to the finals off the back of that incredible performance in Game 5 against the Pistons on the road, he was still getting adulated for that. He was still being, like, he and Kobe and Wade were really considered the standard of basketball at that particular time from an individual standpoint. Now, the next year, LeBron sort of fell off. They dropped in the standing, the seedings to the 4th seed, played terribly the first 6 games up against the Boston Celtics, and LeBron had but a very good Game 7 performance up against Paul Pierce. And Paul Pierce had a hell of a performance too in that series, in that Game 7. But no one criticized LeBron for not getting the job done, quote unquote. They all stood up and applauded and cheered for him. So that's an absolute lie. And of course, once again, you get people that just agree with it because it confirms their way of thinking, as opposed to, is this true or not? The next one that I got, Jordan claims Pistons were out to hurt him. That's a newspaper article. I'm not going to read the entire newspaper article, but it's true. They admitted it. That looks pretty dumb to be pointing that out to me. This is like a screenshot. I'll read it out to you. This is the first time I'm reading all of these, by the way. I knew where this is going, but this is the first time I'm reacting to it. Jordan popularized the game on a global scale and inspired millions to play basketball, correct? Jordan lover, yes. So back to me. So if more people started playing basketball, that would mean that there is an increase, that would increase the chance of there being more great players, right? Jordan lover, sure, I guess. Therefore, it's true, Jordan played in a weaker era than Jordan, right? Than LeBron, right? Jordan lover. Angry face. Once again, you can't prove any of that. It's all hypotheticals. I have not seen this level of a meltdown and of emotional meltdown than when Trump won the election and a bunch of, Hillary Clinton and Democrat supporters. How do you even argue that? Either way, how do you argue whether there's an increase in talent? If it's relative, you won't be able to see it. And that goes both ways. But I will say this. Why is there always a question as to whether Jordan would survive in this era? After what we just saw with the Pistons and what they were trying to do to Jordan, what they were doing to Larry Bird as well, there's got to be some kind of a question as what LeBron how he would have mentally handled that. Because if JJ Barea, if Deshaun Stevenson can get in under the skin of LeBron James and cause him to implode the way they did, then can you imagine what would have happened if they had Dennis Rodman on him in his prime, John Sally in his prime, Rick Mahorn taking his head off, Bill Laimbeer taking his head off? Can you imagine what would have happened? There's got to be some serious doubt with that. Okay, next one. Bulls win in 6, Cavs lose in 5. Comparing finals records ain't it. And it's talking about the statistics. So Michael Jordan, 27.3 points per game, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 steals. LeBron, 33 points per game, 12 rebounds per game, 10 assists per game. Oh, it's talking about the 2017 finals. The one where he was thoroughly outplayed by Kevin Durant and he didn't play any defense whatsoever on Kevin Durant. That's an excellent example. After being down 3 games to... Oh my God. After being down 3 games to 1, Jordan lost to the Detroit Pistons in 1988 in the second round. But for LeBron, he won in the 2016 finals. This has got to be the worst one I've seen so far. What about all the other instances where he's lost after he's been down 3 games to 1? You idiots! That's a terrible one. He did it once. He did it one time. So and the fact that that's the only time that they could pull out that Jordan's been down 3 games to 1 in a series. All right. Next one. Michael Jordan's first 3 seasons with the Bulls. 1985, 38 and 44, 86, 30 and 52, 87, 40 and 42. surely in MJ's amazingly tough era, those records weren't good enough to make the playoffs, right? Well, actually, okay, yeah. Some lower teams, but the teams were actively tanking as well to try to get there, including the team in '86. I think if the Bulls wanted to go after a playoff spot in '86, which they still happened, they still got in. But if the management didn't try to handcuff Stan Albeck and put a minute restriction on Jordan, their record would have been a lot better than 30 wins. All right. Since 2001, LeBron is 6-0 in Game 7s. Just let that sink in. Okay. I don't understand what the point of that is. It's true. It's totally true. In the span of only 2 seasons, Isaiah beat Magic, Larry Bird, Kareem, and Jordan twice, and no one ever talks about it. That's not true. I actually talk about it, and it nearly happened in one playoff series. One playoff. If it wasn't for Isaiah turning his ankle in the '88 finals, he would have done it all in one playoff run. Summary of Michael Jordan's Michael Jordan postseason in the '80s: lost in the first round to the Bucks, swept by the Celtics twice, lost 3 straight to the Pistons. Okay, you're talking about 2 of the top 10 teams of all time in the Bucks, in the Celtics and the Pistons, and a very good team in the Bucks that they lost when Jordan was a rookie. If this is a comparison to LeBron, which I'm assuming it is, if we're being consistent with all of this nonsense, then let's look at what LeBron's record was before he went to Miami, and even when he went to Miami, and then after he went to Miami. So he won a couple of championships or 3 championships in there, but there's been a lot of screw-ups along the way as well for him. Jordan never choked in Eastern Conference, 89 Eastern Conference, Game 4. The Bulls were up 2-1. Jordan shoots 33% of the field. In Game 5, he took a total of 8 shots. I'll have to look that one up. Oh, only 1 in the fourth quarter, which was an air ball. Maybe, I've got no idea. As a chance that that's true or not, I haven't looked into it. Throughout the dynasty, it was Pippen who was the team's main on-court leader. Scottie was our team leader. He was the guy that directed our offense and the guy that took on the big challenges defensively. Phil Jackson. Okay, why didn't Phil Jackson go to him in that situation I referenced before, up against the Knicks? Why, if he was the main on-court guy, why was he nearly traded for Dan Marley? And the Bulls wanted that trade, by the way. This is kind of getting boring, though. I'll finish it up on this one. It's showing the starting lineups and saying LeBron took this team to the finals. It's got Dellavedova, Shumpert, LeBron himself, of course, Tristan Thompson, and Mozgov. Mozgov was actually a good player at that point. But LeBron didn't just take that team. They also had Kyrie Irving. Kyrie Irving got injured in the finals because obviously this is 2015. So that is also a lie. This is why this argument gets so boring, quite honestly, because it's not about facts anymore. It's just purely about emotion. And I have not seen, as I said, a fan base more upset than when Hillary Clinton and the Democrats got beaten by Donald Trump and the Republicans. I have not seen it. And it wouldn't surprise me if we start seeing some conspiracy theories in the next week. Oh, well, the Bulls, the NBA wanted the Bulls to be the world champion. At the end of the day, right, if you want to see what the biggest difference is between Jordan and LeBron, look at the path of destruction that Jordan left in his wake. You look at Isaiah Thomas and the Pistons. They were 2-time world champions, defending back-to-back world champions. After Jordan and the Bulls beat them, they never even won a playoff series. Look at Karl Malone and the Utah Jazz. You're talking about the second greatest in terms of points, overall points scored, second all-time leading scorer in Karl Malone, You've got the all-time assist leader in John Stockton, a very good coach in Jerry Sloan, incredible structure, incredible team defense. People talk about there being a big difference between West Coast teams and East Coast teams. That Utah Jazz team, that was more of an East Coast team. They were a physical powerhouse, especially with Karl Malone. They would throw bodies around. And after Jordan and the Bulls beat them twice, they were never the same. They never made it back to the conference finals. Look at Shaq. After Shaq lost in 96, he had to bolt all the way to LA only to be destroyed by Karl Malone and the Utah Jazz twice. And then San Antonio got him another sweep. In the playoff series after Shaq left to go to Los Angeles, in the 3 times that the Lakers were eliminated, they won a grand total in those 3 series, 1 game. They lost 4-1 to Utah in 97. Then they were swept 4-0 by Utah again. And then they lost 4-0 to the San Antonio Spurs. It wasn't until Phil Jackson got there that Shaq was able to emerge. But even then, he wasn't really a clutch closer. It was Kobe. And Kobe wasn't beaten by Jordan. Gary Payton and the Sonics, they never made the conference finals again after losing to the Bulls. We know what happened to Drexler. Drexler was never the same. We know what happened to Barkley. Barkley never made the conference finals again until he teamed up with Drexler and Olajuwon. It's not a coincidence that we're seeing this. Jordan just ripped through teams, and once they lost, they never had their confidence back. Now compare that to LeBron. There's like players get more confident when they play against him. It's night and day. It is absolutely night and day. Speaking of night and day, it's it's time for me to go to bed now. I've talked way too long by myself. 50 minutes. I don't know if I should be proud of that or embarrassed. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And I will catch you in the next one. I'm not sure if I'll do another episode prior to episodes 5 and 6. But we are moving along in this documentary series. After next week's episodes, we'll be more than halfway done. So keep that in mind. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the next show.